Get social with us. Follow us on Instagram at Goodtaste TV.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Good Taste for the Soul. I'm Tangi Patton. You know, these days with social media, everyone's a restaurant critic, right? Scroll through any X feed or Instagram, TikTok, and you're going to see tons and tons of food pictures and people offering their opinions on food. Well, today we're going to interview one of the most high profile food critics in the country now, Bao Ong. He is the food critic for the Houston Chronicle. Fairly new position for him, and he's worked at the New York Times. He's covered the dining scene in New York. And I agree with him when he says Houston has the best dining scene in the entire country. Hope you learn as much from him as I did. Enjoy. Bao Ong, welcome to Good Taste for the Soul. Really excited to talk to you. You have to have the funnest job in the world.
You know, no one feels sorry for me if I have any complaints about my job, which are very few.
Well, I would imagine. You work in what I think is the most exciting dining destination in the country. New York is fantastic, and there's some other great places too. But in terms of size and variety and scope and diversity, I just love Houston. Walk us through a typical week in the life of the restaurant critic for the Houston Chronicle.
So every week, I'm usually plotting out, my dining schedule. I'm probably out at least on average 4 to 6 work meals per week, and that includes lunches. So, it's a lot considering how big Houston is. I'm out in the suburbs. I might be down in Kemah. It takes more than an hour to get from one side of Houston to another. So it's a lot of logistical planning. But then I have my deadlines where I have to turn in my review every week as well. So it's and doing social media content. So it's a lot to juggle.
Now, do you take your own photos or do you guys send a photographer back later?
Luckily, I'm able to, put in photo assignments to our desk, but I do take some of my own photos, especially for social media. And once in a while, I'll use my own photos for a story too.
Wondered about that. That's kind of a luxury, right? You can take some if you want, maybe for memory's sake when you're writing, but then to come back and have a professional photographer there, that's pretty cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about your family. I think a lot of times, depending on how we were raised, in our homes with moms and grandmoms and whatnot, maybe dads that cooked, it can kind of shape, the foods we like and that kind of thing. Tell me about your childhood. Was food a central part of growing up?
So my parents are both immigrants from Vietnam. I'm the oldest of 4 children, and they were very blue collar, working class, Midwesterners, and so we never ate out. It was always a home cooked meal. And so I would go to school and I would have these American lunches, like pizza or chili or sloppy joes, and then I would come home and eat these home cooked meals. My mother was the one that always prepared dinners, and it was always Vietnamese food. Usually there was a soup, a stir fry, obviously a bowl of rice, and so I feel like I got this kind of good scope of experiences early on. But at the same time, I'm as a child, I wanted to eat what all my classmates were eating. I never got to eat Chef Boyardee or Kraft mac and cheese or frozen dinners. So I've always had this curiosity about what those foods were like, and I did eat those things when I was in college and kind of like after college, but I think I was kind of driven by nostalgia, if anything.
So you had all that fantastic home cooked Vietnamese food, and then yet you craved, I'll call it the junk food of America, right?
Definitely.
How funny. Well, how did you get the job at the Chronicle? You have an interesting resume.
So I think I figured out fairly early on that writing was what I was most interested in, but I didn't know, what that meant as a career. At one point I thought, oh, maybe that meant I wanted to be on TV, or then another point I thought I wanted to write about fashion or architecture. And I had an internship at the St. Paul Pioneer Press. That was my first daily newspaper internship. And I had an opportunity to work with the restaurant critic at that newspaper. And my eyes were suddenly, very excited about this world of food writing that I never knew existed. And I didn't know that you could get paid to eat and write about it. So from that point on, I really started thinking about carving out this path into food media. And And my goals were, very ambitious, as, a lot of college kids are when they're finishing graduation. So, and I noticed that a lot of the writers that I looked up to had a really strong reporting background. So I spent the first years of my career actually being a news reporter, covering floods, fires,
Yeah.
school boards, nothing exciting or kind of related to food, but I always looked for these opportunities to write about food. And so after a few years of that, I moved to New York City. I quit my job, moved to New York without a job, and I enrolled in culinary school. And that I kind of used that as a
Wow.
path into the food writing world.
So that was deliberate. You thought it would behoove you to have the culinary skills before you write about and critique someone else's, right?
That's what I was hoping. I was just thinking, I love food. I love cooking. I just moved to New York. I don't really have a job. What should I do? And I figured, why not go to culinary school, learn as much about food as I can, especially in a city that I wasn't
Yeah.
really familiar with at the time. And that opened up doors. I worked for Gail Green, who was a longtime restaurant critic for New York Magazine. And, I learned a
Yeah.
lot about the industry from her. I blogged for a woman who had one of the first big food blogs in New York at the time. I did end up going to grad school because the economy wasn't very good in 2009, if we all remember that.
Yeah. Over everyone's career, I think they remember those years when the economy wasn't too good. Well, tell me about your time at the New York Times. For a journalist, that historically, things have changed somewhat now in the media landscape, but historically, that was kind of like everyone's aspiration, right? To get a job at the New York Times. What an experience.
No, I feel very lucky. So I went to grad school, straight after culinary school, and they had an opening for an intern on the Metro desk at the New York Times, and I said, you know what, this isn't food related, but let's do it. I'll do anything to get my
Yeah.
foot in the door. And
Get your foot in the
so I,
door.
again, yes, yeah. I'm like, send me to the Bronx, send me to Staten. I'll go anywhere. I'll fetch coffee. I'll make copies. I'll do anything, just to kind of, get a byline in the New York
Smart.
Times. And I just worked there. And then I met David Carr, who is from Minnesota. He studied at the University of Minnesota. That's where I went to undergrad. He was a media columnist at the Times then. And I just asked him, hey, can I pick your brain? And he introduced me to Sam Sifton, who was the restaurant critic at the time. And I kind of really came prepared to that meeting with a lot of ideas and enthusiasm. And then he said, well, we got to do something to get you over to the food desk. And that kind of that opened that door. And I kind of did this internship on on the what was called the dining section at the time, and worked there. And then eventually kind of it kind of morphed into a regular freelance role where I wrote a weekly column online, kind of putting together all these different food events in the city, and in addition doing some reporting.
What an
And
experience.
yeah.
Did you work with Eric Asimov at all?
Say that one more time. Sorry.
Did you work with the wine critic? Well, he also critiqued restaurants, but Eric Asimov?
Eric Asmoff. I
Yeah.
never worked with him closely. I remember, he was very nice. I'd say hi to him at his desk. We were in some of the same meetings, but I never got a chance to work with Eric
Yeah.
specifically.
He's one of my wine writer heroes. I just think he's incredibly talented. We've actually worked together a few times. Actually, he's been on this podcast. But anyway, I've always liked
Oh,
him, Eric. And then
Did you talk to him? He wrote a big feature about a winery that was on the North Fork that came down to Hill Country. I forget the name of that specific winery, but he did a big feature about them. They were this small winery on Long Island, and then they moved to Texas. I forget
yes,
why. And
I saw that. You're right.
so,
Yeah, I think he's given a shout out to some Texas wines a few times over his career, but we're trying to get him to do more. Working on that for sure. So the job, you were at the Chronicle before this position opened up, right?
yes. So I moved to Houston in summer of 2022. I think that July is still the hottest on record. But
On the
just
edge of the
dove right
pandemic.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I was hired
Yeah,
on as
big
a
change.
restaurant columnist. Yes. But yes, I started as a restaurant columnist, where I got to write some first person columns. For example, pretty early on, I wrote about how I thought Houston was a much more exciting dining city than New York City, for example. But I
Ah,
really kind of spent the
good for
last
you.
few years, yeah, just spent the last few years dining out as much as possible here in Houston, getting to learn the dining scene, writing a lot of features, writing a lot of news, trying to break news. And then when this opportunity came up to move into the restaurant critic role, I was very excited because it was something I kind of had
Yeah.
given up on in terms of being a restaurant critic. I knew that I wanted to stay in food media, but I think through the years, the jobs of being a restaurant critic are so few and far in between
Oh, a
that I just
handful,
thought,
right?
oh yeah, I just like it's like I don't think I want to pigeonhole myself into being a restaurant critic. So, but when this came up, as a very very nice surprise.
Yeah, I would think too. And what a fun thing to do. So, how do you decide which restaurants you're going to review?
I think as a service to readers, at least half of the restaurants I review are new restaurants. The buzzy
Hmm.
spots, the spots that a lot of readers want to know. Like, is this worth my money? Should I spend my time and money here at this trendy buzzy restaurant? But I'm also trying to find spots that people don't know about. Whether it's in the suburbs or maybe it's in a strip mall or a gas station.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to also write about those smaller places. And I think places that really reflect what dining means in Houston right now. What do these restaurants say about our culture, our dining culture, our food culture? And trying to find spots that help tell that story. And I
Yeah.
think a big part of telling that story is also revisiting old places. The places that have been around a long time, whether it's a Tony's or maybe it's Brennan's, or maybe it's a smaller, a breakfast club. There's just so many places that really kind of tell this story of, Houston's rich dining scene that I think, as a critic, I think I have to try to do my best job at capturing that kind of, what Houston
Well,
is all about.
the culture, right? Because I think one of the cool things about the restaurant culture in Houston is it's so collaborative and so supportive.
Definitely. A lot of chefs have talked about that, since I've moved here and, depending on the various stories I've worked on. More recently I worked on a story about all the different chef collaborations that take place in Houston and how that's like very exciting for diners. And that, for myself, that's one of the most exciting parts about dining out in Houston is all these different pop-ups or different collaborations that, chefs and
Yeah.
restaurants work on together.
Well, I have to say, I have a lot of respect for restaurant critics, right? Because in my line, I hate to use the word criticize, but I'm not really critiquing. I'm more celebrating places I like. Is it hard to write a critique? A good review's easy, but is it hard to write a not so good one?
It is, you never want to be, you know, uh mean or unsensitive without, thinking about it, 2, 3 times
Yeah.
because, these jobs are, these businesses are, are the livelihoods for people. They're putting a lot of, energy and time and hopes into these restaurants. And when you are more critical, I think, it is difficult because you do feel that pressure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think what separates restaurant critics from, uh, an influencer who might be paid to, post about a restaurant, it's very different. That I'm always thinking of the
Yeah.
reader first and foremost, and how am I an advocate for the reader? We may not agree on everything,
Mhm.
but in my role as a critic, I'm always thinking, like, would I tell, family and friends to dine at this place, or if a stranger walked up to me and they had, $100 to spend
Yeah.
for a weekend dinner, would I be able to, give them my, recommendation, and I kind of use that principle in terms of guiding my reviews.
Have you ever written one and that you wish you could get back?
Ooh, that I wish I could get back. Sometimes, I've wondered, is this, should I have given this restaurant more time?
Mhm.
I really wanted to, give it that one extra star, but it's just kind of based on like all my visits, it didn't quite hit it, and I wanted to give it, I think I wondered, maybe if I waited a few more months, but then also, what if the restaurant wasn't open in a few months? And maybe that review, even if it wasn't a 4-star review, helped the restaurant
Yeah.
or just kind of introduce it to a wider audience. I
Yeah.
definitely have felt that way because, a lot of us, we're trying to get to places first, but at the same time, we have to give these restaurants a fair shot. And, I usually wait at least a few months
Yeah.
before reviewing
I do
a
too. I don't
restaurant.
like to go to I don't pass judgment. If you've only been open a month or so, they're still trying to figure out their systems and all of that. So that would be a tough one. But you bring up a good point. How many times do you visit a restaurant before you do a review? What is the method?
At least 3 times, and, I go as anonymously as possible. I never,
Yeah.
unless it's impossible, it's these reservation systems that exist today make it a little bit difficult, or some of these prepaid, tasting menus can make it a little bit tricky, but, I always make reservations in different names, or if I'm bringing friends with me to a dinner, I ask them to make a reservation, and, just to not draw any attention to myself as little as possible. Obviously, at some restaurants, they are on the lookout, or they do notice that a critic is in the dining room. And
Yeah.
but we never ask for anything extra. And if chefs kind of send out something, we always make a point to like pay for that dish as well. And obviously, we're the Chronicle pays for all these reviews, and just trying to be as objective as possible.
Yeah, everyone's human. I mean, it's hard. I don't think anyone's infallible, but yeah, you guys certainly have some good rules in place to try and ensure that absolutely happens. How do you think, with social media, everybody thinks they're a restaurant critic or reviewer, and in a sense, that they kind of are. But how has social media, do you think, affected what you do, or has it?
Definitely. I think social media has evened the playing field in many ways, which I think is a good
Mhm.
thing, especially for a city as large as Houston, where no one person could ever cover the dining scene,
True.
authoritatively in terms of like having it at every single restaurant. There are more than 10,000 restaurants in this city.
Yeah.
Obviously, there have been people who have been doing this a long time and have a great wealth of knowledge, and we respect them. But no one person can really cover. Even myself, I can't cover every restaurant in Houston. So I think social media has kind of helped even that playing field and bring a larger audience to places that may not have been on the radar of a restaurant critic at a more established outlet like the Houston Chronicle. So I think in that sense it's good. I'm always on social
Yeah.
media to find new places, to see what's popular, what's trending. Um, and it's also allowed more independent operations to maybe they'll go viral because someone with a big following discovered them, or maybe they reached out to them and got coverage that way. um and at the same time, I think it's also put pressure on legacy media outlets like the Houston Chronicle to step into social media. And we're always thinking about, okay,
Yeah.
besides the written review, how else will this review live? Should it be on TikTok? Should it be on Instagram? How do we promote it on Facebook? Do we, should we re-explore podcasts and or a YouTube channel? Thinking of all these different ways to reach
Yeah.
readers. So I think, and I think obviously like social media has affected a lot, affected critics in terms of remaining anonymous. It's virtually impossible to
Forget
be
it, right?
anonymous these days.
Forget it. Well, I noticed the New York Times just named their new food critic, and there's 2 now, and they're both women, and for the first time ever, they published their photos and just said, they're diving in, and it's impossible nowadays to stay anonymous.
It is, and for the longest time, when I really thought that my kind of end goal was just, like to be a restaurant critic, I was very low key online. I never published my photos, on social media. I kind of avoided group photos, and I would ask people to scrub my photo offline if it somehow made it up on a Google search. But and kind of how I alluded to earlier, I kind of gave up on this restaurant critic dreams. I kind of like started putting my face out there a little bit more. Just because, and it's just kind of impossible to be a working journalist in 2025 and not have a photo of you floating around. And and I think there are some really good arguments about why, um, critics shouldn't have to be anonymous anymore.
Do you have a favorite Houston restaurant?
Ooh, this is tough, but I feel like my default answer and usually has been Squabble, just because it's such a good, kind of like neighborhood joint that, a place that you can go to, whether it's, you know, random weeknight or if it's like a little bit of a celebratory meal and or it's a little bit more special of an occasion. I feel it kind of hits all these checks off all these boxes that I look for
Say the
in a
name
restaurant.
again. Say the name again
Squabble?
for everyone. Squabble. Okay.
Squabble.
Okay. So that's a place you would go if you weren't assigned to go, just for fun.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely have. That's probably been one of the restaurants I've been to the most for non-work meals.
Huh. Good to know. Good to know. Let me just ask you because a lot of people, as evidenced by everyone on Instagram, wants to be a food critic, a food writer, and I'm sure there are very many journalists out there that would love to do that too. What advice would you have for someone wanting to land a job like this?
Well, I think if you want to be in a role at an outlet like the Houston Chronicle or some of these national outlets that still employ a restaurant critic, first and foremost, writing and reporting. I
Yeah.
think those are the most important skills. At the end of the day, I'm not telling you, is the pizza or burger good or not. I'm trying to give you more than that in a review. I'm trying to give you a sense of context. I'm trying to build an argument or, to build a narrative or to, have a certain voice. So really developing those skills as a writer and reporter, I think are really important. But also like understanding food. And that means, eating widely, kind of traveling, understanding, seeing lots of the world, kind of outside of where you live, because, that gives you context into what you're writing about. And maybe some of that context is because you have spent time working in a restaurant, or maybe you're a really avid home cook, or about a specific cuisine really well, or you just dine out prolifically, which I think helps you in a job like being a restaurant critic. So I guess my main advice: there's no one direct route. I think everyone's kind of come into this job on a different path, because it is so rare to be able to be in a position of a restaurant critic.
Yeah, it's very rare. And I love when you were talking earlier about your career path. And it's one thing I think I'll get on my advanced experience in age a horse a little bit is you were willing to do anything to get your foot in the door. You didn't come in with an expectation of the corner office or a 9 to 5 job, right? If you want something,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it was, a lot of, trying to work on your skills as a journalist, but also, there's the networking part of the job, and also just trying to working on your craft, and that takes time.
Yeah. Well, you are certainly a bright spot to open the Chronicle website. I love it every time I see one of your columns pop up. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. I learned a lot about you, which was a lot of fun, and I loved hearing about how you approach the story and the perspective.
Thank you so much. I hope we share a meal together soon.
I do too, Bao. And if the video on this doesn't upload properly, we will be sooner than you
Okay,
think.
deal.
Okay, great. Thank you so
Sounds
much. You have a
good.
wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.
Okay, please let me know when you're in Houston next.
Okay, will do.
Okay, thanks, Angie. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Get social with us. Follow us on Instagram at Goodtaste TV.